I don't see how anyone can hold the position that there's nothing to see here. There's nothing that warrants serious investigation. I think the uncontested facts warrant, no matter what your underlying beliefs of the true reality behind like what we're observing in these public statements and these reports, needs to be investigated by institutions that have some shred of accountability and legitimacy.
Matt, thanks for joining us. Or is it Chris? We had this quick story. We shared numbers on Signal at the conference, and I text the group, for some reason having Chris Pines in my head because I'm a Star Trek nerd, I guess. And so I referred to Matt as Chris, and it got a little strange for a minute till he responded in the morning, was like, oh, it's all cool. But yeah, I was sweating it for a little bit while I was like, man, he must think I'm the biggest asshole in the world. We've spoken for like an hour and a half, and he doesn't even know my name. Like, what a dick. So sorry about that, but you were totally gracious about it.
Hey, Matt is a forgettable name. There's like millions of us millennials named Matt.
You're
right.
It's
a good name, though.
You're right. It is forgettable.
I am the guy, though, that will text the random wrong group, the thing talking shit about the person in that group, and then oh, shit, how am I going to recover from this one? As you saw a couple nights ago, Dan and I were supposed to be texting each other about this episode, and then I included you, which wasn't anything bad, but it was just like, God damn it, I always do that.
You talk about presumptuous, though. Guy does us a solid, Josh, spends hours on the show, on email, on Signal, and then can't even get his fucking name right. I think it happened because we were talking about you. I was talking about you. I was like, Matt, this and that. We were on the analyst test together, and Josh was like, oh, shit. I think I texted him and called him Chris. I'm like, you dumb fuck.
Got good OPSEC. You never know much.
There you go.
How are you? Give us just a 30-second, minute life update. What's going on with you?
Yeah, I mean, professionally, things are really busy. Director of Security Intelligence at the Krebs Stamos Group, where obviously, our consulting practice is focused on the intersection of geopolitical, cybersecurity, emergence technology risks. So let's just say that that set of issues isn't going away. So yeah, professionally, really busy. It's a small firm, so we're all sort of grinding. Lots of interesting engagements, but you kind of have to wear multiple hats when you're a small company. It's exciting, interesting work. So yeah, that's where 99% of my time is focused on those sorts of interesting problem sets. But it's going well, and yeah, really engaged in a lot of interesting issues on China questions, AI risk management questions, emerging technology across the board, and business strategy. So yeah, that's a little outside of maybe the Bitcoin alien topic we might get into, but that's what I spend most of my time doing.
Yeah, but their intersections there, I'm sure, are vast and wide. You can AI could arguably be alien technology. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll probably get there.
Lots of things are possible.
Yeah.
In the giant spectrum of things we would love to chat about, we've had to pare it down, which has been extremely painful for the two of us. But we have two priorities today.
Mm-hmm.
One big priority is and we're dead serious about this. This is not some joke or hoax or whatever. We want to talk about the UAP developments. We'll use the alien word. I threw up the green background here just to kind of channel the,
And the new word is non-human intelligence.
NHI.
Okay?
We'll get into that.
NHI.
Before we get into that stuff, though, last time you were on here, we did talk a lot about geopolitics, and we just hit the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. We didn't talk a ton about Bitcoin. And one of our biggest priorities in this hour and a half is to have you hit what you view as tangible risks, maybe the bearish side of Bitcoin. Our last episode with Jesse Myers-Croesus, we got, dare we say, hyperbolically bullish to some extent. And we share a lot of that. But Josh and I also have another side of the coin where we're constantly steel manning. We do see vulnerabilities, and we never use the word inevitable. So especially with someone with your background, your balance, your research mindset, why don't you start off this episode giving us some high-level thoughts of how you see Bitcoin here and now in the year 2023, and maybe particular focus on what vulnerabilities you think exist currently.
Yes, certainly. I guess I would bucket the set of risks that I would think about into sort of two areas. One would be like endogenous risks to and from Bitcoin, and exogenous risks to Bitcoin. So essentially, risks that might emerge as a result of Bitcoin's sort of own development in terms of like broad, right? Whether it's technical development, the ecosystem of stakeholders involved, the consensus and meta consensus that underpins it as an open software project, sort of emerging monetary protocol. That set of risks and sort of ways that, Bitcoin could go wrong or could stall out or could sort of become a victim of its own vulnerabilities over time, and then exogenous risks, right? So other actors that use instruments of power that they have at their disposal to constrain Bitcoin, limit Bitcoin's spread and adoption overall. So those are like two big buckets of risk. So within sort of that like endogenous bucket, I think you think about timescales, right? And think about like risks to Bitcoin. You kind of have to find like, well, what does that mean? Like, from what vantage point are you evaluating risk? And like risk in terms of what like outcome, right? So like failure of what kind? When you have, this thing like this emerging monetary phenomenon, right? Like, okay, well, what are your expectations? And so risk might be we don't meet those expectations, right? Like if someone 10 years ago, their definition of success was it reaches, $500 billion of total market value, and it's got adoption by several, million people, at least holding like at least one Bitcoin. So like they would say, okay, well, it's been a success, right? Like that was my definition of success 10 years ago. We've reached that. Everything else is, we'll see what happens and we'll let it ride. So like, it's a matter of like anchoring against expectations and whether you think those expectations are going to be realized over a certain time horizon. That's like a lot of like sort of like prefacing, right? Risk is in the eye of the beholder. Failure is in the eye of the beholder. And if your expectations are it becomes global money in the next 5 years, right? Well, then there's going to be a lot of things that you would see as risks to that scenario playing out because you have such an extremely high bar for success, right? Like the chance of failure against that measure of success is going to be very high. Whereas if your measure of success is it sort of slowly, gradually increases in adoption, maybe it increases in value at a certain percentage point, over the next 10 years. Okay, well, that the scenarios in which that fails or that scenario is exposed to risk are maybe less likely. So again, all just sort of bounding the question because I think people sometimes bring in their assumptions over what is the inevitable trajectory of Bitcoin, and they sort of reference risks against that. I think sort of where we are now, right? Bitcoin is certainly an established phenomenon globally. Like there are millions of people that use it. There are millions of people that hold it. There are, major serious capital investments into Bitcoin. So it has now like a foothold in kind of a global ecosystem of existing capital, technical development, users, and also like a public discourse. So those are things that are hard to like change. Those things have inertia. Those things have, people have status quo bias. People have sort of cognitive inertia. They don't just like change their minds overnight. So I would expect, like all things being equal, like inertia to take over, and it just sort of, I don't expect catastrophic failure, but I also don't expect, some like bolt from the blue all of a sudden it becomes global money, right?
Yeah. I think that's an important point because tempering your expectations is really important. And in order for this to bolt from the blue, to see this God green candle that everyone talks about and jokes about, that means that on the other side of things, there has to be a cataclysmic problem in the traditional finance system, which is something that I think anyone who actually thinks about this deeply doesn't want to see happen, because that's going to be a very negative scenario for everybody across the board, including people that are quote unquote prepared holding Bitcoin, because you still have to live in this society. As Jeff Booth has said before, you don't want to be the richest guy in the slums. That's just not a place you want to necessarily be.
Yes. And so I would say from where we are now against, I would say like the median expectation by 2030, like the risks against that sort of median expectation in the endogenous domain, I would point to a few things that are, things to be, wary of, right? One would be consolidation and maybe soft capture of the mining system by G7 nations, right? So right now, I think at least 50%, maybe much more than that, of the global hash rate exists in G7 countries. And the geopolitical sort of winds are blowing in the direction of sort of a techno war between East and West, principally between the G7 and Eurasian sort of power blocks centered in China. And this is going to lead to a fragmentation and a splintering and the weaponization of the global technology and financial networks that underpinned the global system. And so you would just naturally expect sort of a global internet endogenous money system that relies on integrated global semiconductors, supply chains, global cloud, sort of computing infrastructure premised on, the open internet. Like these things may not be a anchored assumption in the next 5 or 10 years. And increasingly, lots of things that were considered to be politically neutral, like computing in general and access to computing hardware and the ability to run any computing you want on any given power source, those things are going to be geopolitically and politically contested. Like you're already seeing out of the sort of corner of the policy space when it comes to the China export controls on emerging semiconductors and on concerns over extreme say negative externalities from AI. There is likely going to be a push for a regime that extends what you see right now in the financial system of sort of know your customer to cloud computing. So sort of KYC for cloud service providers. We already have, a very strict export control regime over semiconductors. So we're restricting certain actors in the global system, in this case, namely Chinese companies, from getting access to Western technology. They can't be provided services from Western companies. Individuals can't go work for those companies. They can't buy the most advanced chips and chip making equipment. Maybe soon there'll be like a KYC regime imposed on cloud service providers. So like AWS and Azure, may not be able to provide certain computing services to Chinese entities. So what does this have to do with Bitcoin, right? Well, you can imagine like the logic, the motivational structure behind setting up that type of surveillance and control regime over global computing, right, is a very similar regime that you would imagine if you started to perceive Bitcoin as a threat, right? Oh, we need to cut off access to the underlying hardware, or it's constrained in some way geopolitically, and guess what? You go to the back of the line, Bitcoin miners. Or, the idea of transnational cross-border open computing becomes something that is geopolitically fraught. And so you can imagine lots of soft, maybe even hard coercion being brought to bear on public entities that are accountable to regulators, right? They're listed public mining companies, or they're very large pools of capital, and they can be coerced into maybe not building a block on a certain transaction that the G7 doesn't want to be built into the canonical chain tip. So that is sort of something I would be worried about, right? Is not just a risk from, the Bitcoin mining community becoming, say, just geographically concentrated, but that geopolitical pressures make that concentration, vulnerable. You could also imagine just, right now everyone involved in Bitcoin mining is like a Bitcoin diehard, right? There are people who do it because they sort of are almost ideologically committed to the open source software project. But fundamentally, people are motivated by financial interest. And the game theory of Bitcoin mining is premised on people not wanting to sacrifice the fee, right? Not wanting to censor the chain because they'll lose money. But if you have actors that are not financially motivated, right, then that game theory could break down. And then it's a question of, well, to what extent can the network, resist that through decentralization, right? So concentration of hash rate in jurisdictions where political pressure can be brought to bear, I think is a real risk. And I think miners know that. And there's a reason why miners are trying to become politically engaged. And so that is, I think, the clearest kind of mechanism of sort of risk if you're worried about a certain type of coercion. And this could happen in a way that's like extreme, like there's an OFAC order, or it could just be, hey guys, we all know it's bad to let North Korea, put this transaction on the chain. We all agree North Korea is bad. We all agree that North Korea doesn't, they're just big bad people, and we're just not going to process. Like, it could just be a social emerging agreement among the miners that, there're just certain transactions that we're just going to agree not to, certain addresses that we're just going to agree to not build on.
I just want to clarify this really quick because I'm curious. So it sounds like one of your exogenous examples is effectively that when this regulation does happen on AI, it's going to kind of bleed over or ride the coattails into other computing systems that are potentially negative for the state in certain ways, which Bitcoin is obviously, as it grows larger, it can become something more of an adversary to the state where they'll already have that foothold to say, like with this KYC or this limitation that we've already provided because AI systems can potentially create biological weapons or whatever other systemic risks they could actually engender that could bleed over into Bitcoin in certain ways, in your view?
It's more about the regulatory regime and the logic behind putting in place conditionalities and constraints on private sector actors getting access to underlying, semiconductor hardware, as well as provision of cross-border sort of computing, right? Like the idea that we could just have anyone buy and sell computing services, hardware and software across borders could become in question. And so like Bitcoin as a form of cross-border, computing and relies on advanced semiconductor inputs in the supply chain for Bitcoin mining, like it will be affected. The question is to what extent those that policy framework would be explicitly directed at Bitcoin as a way to attack Bitcoin, or the Bitcoin is just sort of incidentally affected by
just a casualty on the side.
Yeah, like overall sort of the splintering of the global technology supply chains, the conditionalities placed on computing cross-border, and just in general, like it getting caught up in this fractious and sort of fracturing technology system that we've built in the last 30 years. So that's where I see just sort of the direction of travel going, and Bitcoin sort of sticks out like a sore thumb in that environment. Like it doesn't respect national borders. It doesn't endogenously respect OFAC sanctions. It doesn't say a miner can not buy a certain set of chips to run the hash function on, right? And so that is, we're moving into a world where getting access to those sorts of chips and being able to provide these types of services, and just individuals, right? Like you can imagine extreme scenarios where, lots of blocks get put on, companies that are engaged in Bitcoin from certain jurisdictions, and any, transactions with them are fraught, and it creates a lot of complexities that Bitcoin is not designed to respect, right? The whole point is it's an open source software. No one controls it. No one can say this is okay, this is not okay. These are the rules. You abide by the rules. The protocol lets the transaction go through. In a world where lots of these sorts of transactions that used to be politically neutral now become politically and geopolitically fraught, that tension I expect to grow. And that just becomes a source of risk over time.
Some of what you mentioned kind of brings to mind software to me. I haven't read the book yet. I have it. It's just one of my list of books to read. So I'm not going to pretend as if I have a full grasp or understanding of it, but I've seen enough podcasts and listened to him enough to understand it pretty well. You're saying that if that scenario plays out where nation states are, like the G7 countries you mentioned, are mining and then somehow trying to censor transactions, it sounds almost counterintuitive to his point. He seems to think that's a good thing that nation states get involved at that scale. And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a negative in total, or is that a positive thing?
And before you go, I think 200 page. I think I'm at about the 200 page mark of software. So I'm just kind of cresting into where he really starts talking about Bitcoin. But I have the same exact question, Josh, and it's actually something I've jotted in the notes several times. If you have nation states who have the lion's share of hash rate, they're going to have the ability to dictate what goes on chain in a very profound way. You see it differently?
Right.
It's a great question, Josh, because I'm asking the same thing and I'm midway through the book. Maybe the answer comes here in the last 150 pages, but curious on your take.
Yeah, I mean, this all gets back to your definition of success, right? Like,
yes,
if your definition of success is, Western G7 powers have control over the hash rate, then it'd be a good thing to incentivize and to write policy papers that recommend that those institutions take an affirmative position in taking control of the mining infrastructure. I'm not sure the average person who's running Bitcoin and the average Bitcoin miner would like to compete with the state on that, and that the end result of that is likely to lead to a network that provides the same sorts of centers of resistance that they expected to provide to them now. So Bitcoin could still run, right? The blocks would still arrive. It would just become essentially a co-opted system, right? It'd be just a really expensive way of running, a permissioned blockchain, right? The whole premise behind Bitcoin is it's it's a permissionless system, right? So if in the act of trying to defend it from attack, you turn it into a permission system, it can still work. Transactions can still run. In fact, it might still even have a lot of value. You can imagine a scenario where people go, oh, great, the G7's behind Bitcoin. I'm going to hold a lot of it now, right?
Right.
But the original cypherpunks would roll over in their grave.
For sure. I mean, it's basically like nation states. I mean, it's Bitcoin selling out. I mean, obviously it isn't doing that, but it's effectively, it's become a shell of itself at that point.
Here's the thing, though.
At least to the cypherpunks.
The comment that needs to be thrown in here, though, and what still makes Bitcoin unique and viable, even in that scenario, is unlike a proof of stake system, that power over the network is not indefinitely held. Mining is a relentlessly and perpetually free market, the way I see it. So, yes, the notion that the United States of America is the world hegemon and has the massive majority of hash rate, the thought that that's going to go away anytime soon is probably unrealistic. But in that scenario, you fast forward 5, 10, 15 years, the global landscape changes, control or power over hash rate is always up for grabs. And I think that's part of Lowry's thesis, is that there is this new settlement layer that's open to the free market indefinitely.
Well, so there's two things I would say. One is in evaluating those different scenarios, you have to evaluate the motivation and capabilities of the actors in the system, and that can change the dynamics. And so in that scenario, actors that you're trying to model, their intent and capabilities are a collusion between large Bitcoin mining companies and a handful of Western powers, and you have to model out what is their changing set of incentives that structure their motivation and their capabilities, right? So like political, agitation, ideological motivation, fractures between alliances and interests can change intent. Like, do we want to keep up this collusion? Do we want to break from the coalition? And capability. Do we actually have the ability to enforce the coalitional censorship regime that we want to put in place? And there's things that you could do to counter both of those, right? That you could undermine the intent and capability. On the capability side, it could just be they lose access to those chips. They physically move to a different jurisdiction. They get sabotaged. The software gets changed in terms of like Stratum v2. And like there's lots of, you could go down the branching tree and look at countermeasures and reactions. The fundamental thing, though, I would point to is what you mentioned is like there are scenarios where you can have a game theoretically stable coalition that just indefinitely controls the hash rate, because they can always attack any other chain. They can always have, especially if they're not financially motivated, right? This is the whole premise of this, right?
Yeah.
If their objective is to say, we want to have a permission system that we control, we're willing to basically take cost, right? We're willing to lose money, and you have the intent and capability to execute that plan, you can do that. I mean, there's a great book by Micah Warren called Bitcoin, A Game Theoretic Analysis, and it works through under different assumptions. And again, it's all just like, a theoretical model of where you could find coalitional incentives form that lead to like an enduring censorship regime, because the coalitional incentives among a handful of players that are not financially motivated endures. And yeah, the question is, in that scenario, right, do people just take their ball and go home and go, Bitcoin's dead? Micah has an interesting thesis, which is actually, if you play this out, one of the ways that you can imagine this scenario like being relatively stable is that Bitcoin's price may not actually be hurt, right? And so like this is where the true strategy that would be dangerous to Bitcoin would be one where everyone's bags are protected, if not boosted, but the censorship resistance properties of the network are compromised over time. And then eventually you get enough of this, the economic majority of the participating nodes that are willing to, make that trade-off over time. And leverage human nature's fundamental greed, right, as opposed to its orientation towards autonomy and resistance to coercion, right? Like that's how you could imagine. Again, this is all just gaming out like different scenarios.
Howdy, plebs. It is Dan here. I want to take a minute to talk to you about Crowd Health. What Crowd Health is doing in the healthcare space is nothing short of remarkable. If you're already familiar with Crowd Health, you can visit joincrowdhealth.com crowdhealth.com/BCB and use code BLUE for a tantalizing 3-month trial discount. As you probably know by now, the two of us are career firefighter paramedics. Nearly 70% of our calls are medical related, and we both rotate over to an ambulance. We're the first link in the chain in the healthcare system, and we see just how broken it is. Injured and sick patients stressed out of their mind, primarily worried about the incoming hospital bill. CrowdHealth offers an extremely simplistic and workable alternative to traditional healthcare setups for a freaking fraction of typical premiums. It's essentially the decentralization of healthcare, leveraging the power of Bitcoin alongside healthcare crowdfunding to drastically uncomplicate healthcare and give back control to patients. CrowdHealth negotiates bills for their members and finds them the best doctors and hospitals. Do yourself a favor. Visit joincrowdhealth.com/BCB. That's joincrowdhealth.com/BCB. And use code BLUE during sign up to receive a max discount crowdfunding request of $49 a month. Yes, $49 for the first 3 months. The Blue Collar Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by arguably the most legendary company in Bitcoin, CoinKite. They are the producers of the renowned Cold Card, the world's most trusted and secure Bitcoin signing device, built with a plethora of features fit for Bitcoin beginners all the way up to the most advanced of users. This device is a one-stop shop for your Bitcoin custody needs, and something the two of us have trusted for years. CoinKite also manufactures the Block Lock, a gorgeous e-ink digital display art piece sitting in the background of what seems to be every serious Bitcoiner on the planet. Block Lock can be programmed to scroll through key Bitcoin metrics, including price, hash rate, next halving date, and much more. Boy, oh boy, will this thing look good in your living room or office. They are also the makers of many other security and fun products for all users, no matter their technical aptitude. Support our show and get a delicious discount on CoinKite products by following our affiliate link on the screen and in the notes, and using code BCB for 5% off the Cold Card. I have a couple comments as we sort of, unfortunately, probably close this section out and get to the NHI stuff. The first thought I have is immediately an example that pops in my head about a non-economically motivated sovereign balance sheet is what's going on in golf right now between the PIF and the PGA Tour. They spun up this live tour in competition to the PGA Tour, and it's really the first time we've seen full frontal non-economic motivation out of a sovereign balance sheet enter the private sector of sports, offering numbers that there's no way they're going to recoup to PGA Tour professionals, spinning up tournaments with absolutely no hope of returns, just to whatever their motivation is, whether it's sports washing or something else. And what it has done is completely fuck up the free market in golf. I'm not saying it's bad for the spectator, but the PGA Tour immediately had to pivot, cuck down, include them in the decision-making process, and now we've got this big body. And what it represents, it's a microcosm of you cannot get out of the straitjacket when someone with that amount of buying power enters an arena. Even if you hope and wish it's a free market, these are huge players that massively change the dynamic. And Bitcoin's very small. Yes, hash rate looks expensive when you look at it on your block clock. But when you think about a sovereign balance sheet entering the ring, it's kind of a gorilla against a mosquito, at least at this date and time.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is, because I think there's like 3 forms of consensus that underpin sort of Bitcoin right now, or Bitcoin as a project. And so you can imagine attacks against all 3 forms that you could explore in much more detail. Like, one is just like the most common, which is like attack on the canonical state of the chain, which is the traditional 51% attack, right? The other is trying to attack the rules, right? Trying to undermine the social consensus that there is a relatively rigid, maybe even fixed, although that's a separate debate, set of protocol rules that define what Bitcoin is as a project, that it enables censorship resistance, that no change to Bitcoin's rules are acceptable if they deviate from these sort of canonical principles, right? Yeah. The third set of the third type of consensus is that BTC as an asset has value, that people have sort of this sort of subjective, belief that this digital asset has value. And, that's like what you can attack in the market. You could have, short selling. You can do all sorts of things to manipulate the price. You can undermine confidence in it, that sort of thing. And they all intersect to a certain extent, right? But there's like 3 different dimensions of sort of meta consensus around the state of the chain, around the rules of the protocol, and around the value of BTC as an asset. that would be how you would set up the tree of risks, and you would see how they would all interact. I don't have I don't know, I analyze risk for a living, right? I don't have like a probability assigned to each of those and all the different permutations. I just think people are being a little bit Pollyannish if they think it's like inevitable that the destiny of Bitcoin, like nothing is inevitable in reality, right? Contingency in history is a thing, and you then have to have if you believe a certain outcome is more favorable, you have to sort of advocate for it and convince other human beings that outcome is desirable, right? I mean, that's what living in society is.
Yeah.
One of the things that before we move off this topic, the way you were describing nation states kind of wrestling over this, it's kind of weird to kind of mix that idea with Ray Dalio's book Changing World Order, about how all these countries, each one that kind of takes over this hegemon of the world, their currency is the currency that's for the world at that point, which has gone on for the last 500 years, probably into antiquity, longer than that. But what I'm thinking here is the way, if Bitcoin is successful and that ends up being the thing, like when there's a new hegemon, they basically take over the primary mining of Bitcoin and can kind of curtail or control potentially in this kind of dystopian future we're talking about. Some of the transactions or the tip of the block space, as you mentioned. Is that something that you've thought about at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is where my larger analysis of Bitcoin is as a subset of a geopolitical analysis, because as you pointed out, like monetary systems are somewhat downstream of geopolitical regimes, and so if you're postulating a change, either a rapid or a slow evolution in the prevailing monetary system, you'd have to look to associated changes in the geopolitical regime, right? And that's what the lesson of history is that there's sort of a dominant power, their credits are treated as money good in a global trading system, and that helps sort of reinforce the power over time. But it also has this sort of pathology that it leads to a bad balance of payments for that hegemon, right? They have to run increasing deficits to supply those, or they have to increasingly expand their imperial operations to become really expensive, they become a resource drain, social pathologies develop, and eventually the empires collapse. That's kind of the history that Ray Dalio tells. I don't know if we're in, everyone analogizes it to this current moment. There's lots of things that are weird about our current moment, but I think they have, history rhymes, right, but never repeats. And we do see that traditional pattern playing out. I don't know, though, whether, lots of scenarios, but I guess the fundamental premise that I would question is that a new hegemon would rise, as opposed to just a general fracturing and disorder prevailing, right? Where there isn't a new, for example, I do not expect the Chinese yuan to replace the dollar as a global reserve currency. I do not expect their debts to replace the treasury security as a global reserve asset. In the scenario where maybe the U.S., say, backs down from defending Taiwan or loses a war over Taiwan, or we go through a major political domestic rupture that retrenches our power projection, and our allies around the world have to recalibrate, changing security arrangements. That is a situation in which, in general, right, you would just see a rebalancing, right, a more multipolar, multi-currency system. Yeah. There is a use of the dollar that's sort of separate from the hegemonic power of the United States. It's the denomination of choice in the Eurodollar system. So you need collateral, and the best form of collateral right now is a treasury security in that market. So the question is, can you find a better form of collateral if the treasury security ceases to become a good form of collateral in the offshore dollar system? Right now, there isn't a really good alternative. I mean, gold is sort of the next best, but it has its major limitations in a credit-based trading system that's at a scale much, much larger than gold, and that also facilitates speed of transaction and settlement in a 21st century economy. So this is where we are, right? And I guess this is there's a lot of inertia, network power behind the current system, and it won't just fall apart unless there's a total catastrophe, right? But you might see chinks in the armor, especially as the geopolitical competition heats up, structural inflation from friendshoring and remaking supply chains, regreening the economy, increasing defense outlays, increasing social spending for our retirees. These things are all going to put a lot of strain on Western G7 budgets at the same time that their debts are considered the money good collateral in the offshore dollar system. China especially is trying to undermine that system as part of a multi-domain effort to challenge the existing rules-based order. And this is yeah, this is where we're going to see Bitcoin evolve. It's going to be in this increasingly contentious geopolitical and monetary environment. And Bitcoin, I expect, just could be like, I think as Luca was like, last functioning smoke alarm, but also like the most like finely tuned liquidity and like volatility indicator, right? Like I expect it'll just, it'll be like this tail that just wags really fast depending on what's happening in the global system.
Very well said. By the way, if you're a listener and you haven't read Matt's piece, The Future Geopolitical Order in Bitcoin, we will have it linked in the notes. I think it's a must read. I think it really hits this theme of multipolarity, fragmentation, and Bitcoin playing a role. And I think that although we've been, maybe you could say, partially bearish here in the beginning of the episode, I think that future is potentially extremely bullish for this asset. I'll also close this section before I hand the baton off to Josh to get into the real stuff here. I like what you said, Pines, about the monetary stuff being downstream of the geopolitics. And that may not sound fun or sexy or libertarian to the average internet warrior, but it's the reality right now. And it's very likely going to be the reality, at least partial reality in your lifetime. I also just think these sorts of segments on this show are a huge priority for us. We're going to keep doing them. We'll probably do them in higher cadence because there, as you said, Matt, there's nothing inevitable about this. We're as smitten and interested by it as we've ever been, but there's so much unknown. It's so early. Technology is moving so quickly in the 2020s and beyond that to extrapolate 30 years out into the future with complete confidence is totally clownish. Your individual understanding, everyone here, everyone listening, is so limited. I think we said this the first time you were on here. You study these global dynamics for a living. To think that whoever you are, you have a perfect or very clear read on what's happening in the world is extremely naive. We need a healthy skepticism of ourselves. And then lastly, we're seeing examples even the last week of the power yielded by regulators and governments. I am excited that Bitcoin's labeled as a commodity. I am excited that it doesn't pass the Howey test. But these are not inerrant documents that are never going to change. If regulators and policymakers want to fuck with this technology, I'm not saying it's going to bury it, but it's going to wound its valuation in the short term, and you need to be ready for that. I mean, look at the blows they've dealt to the crypto industry. What the SEC has done here, these are really significant measures that could, in many regards, totally maim the crypto industry, not just in the United States, but globally. And if you're a Bitcoin maximalist, that may sound like a great thing, and I think in some ways it is, but it's not as if they can't pivot the blasters to Bitcoin and deal some serious laser shots. So
for sure. And I think what you're saying, Dan, is so important for people to understand. The more you study, the more you research anything, the more you realize how much you don't know. It's as if you step out into this grand plane and it just becomes larger and larger the more you know, and you realize there's no way you ever reach that horizon. So having humility when you make these kinds of predictions for the future is important because nobody really knows. We're all making our best estimation as to where this goes. And that, I think, parlays really well into our next topic, which is, so just to give everyone a lay of the land for my background, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. I love reading all kinds of sci-fi. Matt, your book, Expectation Value, is on my list. It's just my list never ends, and it always incurs a new. So Harry Sudok's got me on the 3-body problem. I'm like halfway through it. That book is stellar, by the way. If anyone's listening and likes sci-fi, read that book. It's amazing. So I'm predisposed to be interested in aliens and have fallen down many rabbit holes of alien lore, as many do. So many times that it's for years, probably a decade I've been reading about this crazy stuff, but no time has it been more interesting than now, in my view. With David Grusch, who's a 14-year veteran of military and intelligence services, having his background vetted by some serious journalists. If you haven't seen the interview with him, we're going to talk about it now. We're going to ruin a whole bunch of it for you, but you should go listen to it anyway because this guy, I don't know if this is some kind of a crazy psyop to mess with all of our heads and distract from something else. It could certainly be that. But
it's working on a couple firefighters if it is.
Sure
I'll tell
is,
you that, Josh.
But this is interesting. And if he is who he says he is, which it seems that he is, he's reading from the playbook of some of the most off-the-wall ideas that have existed in the UFO lore for decades, and is claiming he has seen evidence, at least documentation, and he's talked to people who firsthand have seen this evidence. So, Matt, if you don't mind, start a bit about his background and maybe how he set a craft allegedly was found in Italy in 1933, was hidden by Mussolini.
The Vatican.
And
the
this
Vatican
is
knew
just
about
the
it.
craziest part. The Vatican knew about it, and the Vatican tipped off the U.S., and then we scooped up this craft, and now we have it. Just start there, and let's just we don't have any real I've got so much written about this. There's no way we're going to get through it all. But it's just like, let's just talk about it. Let's just talk about where is the ground here, I guess, is really, I feel like I'm falling through a mist and I have no idea what's what because it's so completely insane.
Wait, before you go too, Matt, because I think I want to speak to one segment of the listener right now here real quick, guys. And that's the person that's, why in the fuck are you guys talking about this? This is ridiculous. I want to talk to that person real quick. I am naturally skeptical, okay? And I am not completely bought into this narrative or idea right now. So I think, first off, I'm just going to communicate to the listenership, you should be skeptical. Bold claims like this, these are very, very bold claims. They need backup. They need substantiation. We shouldn't buy this hook, line, and sinker. I just want to interject some of my experience.
I'm fully erect right now.
For
everyone
by
listening,
the way,
fully erect.
Josh knows that I'm a natural skeptic. It took me more time to buy into Bitcoin. I'm just kind of an eye roller. It takes a long time. I'm a slow mover. I will say, having looked into this for a little while, because of Josh, having been kind of enamored by the Lazar stories, the Commander David Fravor, the Ryan Graves stuff, this feels different right now. My attention is perked. Josh, you made a statement to me after the Grusch announcement and whistleblower and video that you feel like you've gone from thinking this is about a 2% probability of being reality to a 20% probability. And I think that's about accurate for where my headspace is right now. I've gone from mostly dismissing it to suddenly being like, how do we explain this? Because having a high-ranking intelligence officer with the consequences of misinformation that exist and the people he's poking and the prodding he's doing with Congress, more is on the line, and this has entered the realm of seriousness for me. Say that to the segment of the listener that's like more in my shoes, completely
and I totally
dismissing
understand that because there is no evidence, but it's just coming from a place of what seems like harder ground than it's ever come from before. This isn't a Bob Lazar who has got, they can't even vet his background. They don't know if he's actually who he says he is. Matt, if you want to take it and run wherever you want with that, I know that this has been an area of interest for you, and it's probably you could probably go on for 4 hours about this, but let's hear your high-level thoughts on this, first of all.
Yeah, so I guess I should just explain why I pay attention to this at all. I think it's I guess maybe I'm psychologically disposed to thinking about weird things. Like I was always like trying to find the deepest questions. Investigate physics and philosophy as an undergrad. That's what I did as an undergrad. I was going to do a PhD in physics. I was always trying to understand like the answers to the big why questions, right? And of course, extraterrestrial life is always like on the top of that list, right? And I'm also just like my intellectual strategy has been to try to look at things that are somewhat in the corners, somewhat in the tails of the distribution. And in my professional career, a lot of what I did, in my previous consulting life was helping the government think through tail risk scenarios, right? What are those low probability, high consequence events? How do we make sure that we're prepared for them? How do we make sure that we're not ignoring, things we're not, subject to a strategic surprise? So like my intellectual background and my professional trajectory kind of made me just sort of think about things in that sort of corner of the room, right? The sort of the things that maybe you would, if you're just going about your daily life, you could just ignore. But like in my career, like I had to think about things like nuclear war and catastrophic cyber attacks and pandemics and these things that are, not pleasant to think about, but someone has to think through those like low probability, high consequence events. So that's kind of, I guess, my intellectual strategy, my professional background, because maybe prime me to think about these questions. And the other sort of then the point that I would make about, you're right in terms of thinking about this question, not in terms of like binary, do I believe it or do I not believe it, but as a function of credences from 0% to like 100%, right? Like you have to be a Bayesian about anything, right? Your beliefs are a function of evidence. So it's always imperfect. It's always constrained by your background and your existing beliefs. And so you have to evaluate incoming evidence against, what you hope is like a rational backdrop of, existing beliefs. And then you weigh evidence, then you update, and then you look for more evidence, then you update again. It could go up or down. So that's how I try to approach this question in general, is like, as purely Bayesian as possible, trying to put the emotion and the bias and the preconception sort of aside. And then so when we start to evaluate this larger topic, I think I sort of analogize it to like, imagine you're in the middle of a forest clearing, and so you've got a pretty good picture on the well lit clearing you're in, right? You can see the grass, you got clear picture of what's going on around you. You can see a bit into the forest that's immediately adjacent to the clearing. And then you just see dark forest, spreading out in all directions. And I think people in the subject naturally want to jump to, well, what's like the furthest out, right? What are the aliens real? Are they time travel? And so everyone wants to jump outside into the dark forest and try to reason with very, very little purchase on very circumstantial evidence about a whole range of things that you just don't have a solid handle on. And I say, well, just come back to the clearing. Start with what we do have a solid handle on, things that are unambiguous facts about this topic that you can start with. And you establish that as a solid foundation, and then you can work your way out gradually and with circumspection and nuance over time. And so that's where the sensationality of this topic forces people to want to jump into the forest, but you get lost in the forest. You know where you are. And then you might find it hard to come back to the center of the clearing.
I love that analogy. So start us in the clearing in the bright light, and let's get to the edges and find out where these tigers are at.
Hold our hand tight too. I'm scared.
Exactly. So in the center of the clearing, the best place to start, I think, is sort of a brief review of the history of the subject in the public domain. Right? I mean, you could go all the way back to like the 1940s and 50s, and there's tons of books about the sort of legacy public programs the U.S. government had led. Project Sign, Project Grusch, Project Blue Book. There's a whole bunch of documentaries and reports, and this is all in the public domain, that U.S. government throughout the 20th century, officially post World War II, had to respond to public reports of these things and had to put together various panels, various government investigations, written various reports. All the main sum and substance of that was essentially debunking it, casting cold water on it, etc. But it's not like this came out of nowhere, right? Everyone's familiar with this in the pop culture domain, but it's like a serious subject of like bureaucratic effort. This has been a long-standing thing the government has had to deal with and do since like the late 40s. So that's like I'm not going to go the whole history. I think where this recent chapter begins is really 2017, where the New York Times came out with that article. And they had, some gentlemen come forward that had been in senior positions inside the Pentagon and also in the Senate Intelligence Committee, specifically a gentleman named Lou Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, who were kind of like if there's anyone to point to, it was those two individuals who came forward, worked with outside journalists to get these videos released and get these reports published in the New York Times. That sort of, I would say, is the beginning of like the recent history of this subject. And that, I think, is what kickstarted everything you're seeing today, right? And so that's like where you have like the overt evidentiary record of like what happened when.
And wait, as a quick timeout too, because I did go through a brief extraterrestrial UAP phase pre-2017, and I kind of closed the book on it. So another message I want to deliver is if you close the book pre-2017 and haven't reopened it, it is time to do so. Sorry, keep going.
I think that would be a fair judgment. So 2017 is really kind of where this all got started. And Lou Elizondo, who was a career military intelligence official who was tasked to sort of on his sort of, it's debatable whether it was an actual program or whether it was a collateral duty, but he was responsible for something that went by the moniker the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, called ATIP, for almost 10 years, I think. And in that role, he was responsible for collecting reports, principally from the Navy and naval pilots and other individuals that had encounters with anomalous objects, anomalous phenomenon that went under the banner unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or actually it was aerial phenomena, recently changed to anomalous phenomenon. And so that was kind of where it got started. He wasn't like a UFO guy apparently from the beginning, but like he was tasked with his job, and he's like, there's something weird here going on. He tried to give briefings up the chain to his leadership, and apparently some folks around Secretary Mattis at the time sort of stalled him from briefing the SecDef. And so he resigned in protest, wrote a resignation letter saying, Secretary, I've been trying to get this information to your attention. Unfortunately, it was unsuccessful, so I've had to resign in protest, essentially. And so then he, in concert with Christopher Mellon, who was the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence and then was the Senior Staff Director for the majority staff on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, they kind of got together around that time and helped kind of work this angle through the New York Times to get these videos out, and that kind of started everything back then. I won't go through like all the history and the immediate those 3 years. Really, 2020 was when the next sort of inflection point happened, when I think the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time responded to congressional pressure, because the Congress, especially the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, was hearing from folks like Mellon and other folks saying, there's something here, you need to like put the Pentagon's feet to the fire, they're not telling you the truth about what's going on the subject. And a lot of like pilots were saying like, we have, there's like a stigma to report this stuff, like we're almost crashing into these objects, and it's a safety flight issue. So those pilots had come to Congress, had given testimony, and sort of this pressure was building. So the Secretary of Defense signed this memo that created a unidentified aerial phenomenon task force, the UAPTF, I think in like July of 2020, and that actually pulled together some things that had already been like happening, but maybe not as formally on like the UAP subject inside many different parts of the defense and intelligence communities. And so that UAP task force got stood up officially by this DepSecDef memo, but Congress wasn't exactly all that satisfied. Put more pressure on, and they passed like the first FY 2022 National Defense Authorization Act that mandated the creation of what now is called the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. It went through a few different permutations of names as sort of the jockeying between the Pentagon and the DNA and the Director of National Intelligence and the Senate were like, okay.
Is there a bureaucracy in the government that just produces new names for these other bureaucracies? There's a
hot second there. There was one called like the AOMSEG, which was like the Anomaly Oversight Synchronization and Management Integration Group. It was like they were intentionally trying to make it as like impossible to pronounce.
One thing I wanted to chime in here with, because I think we're talking about the same thing, but there's so many names thrown out here, it's hard for me to track. This National Defense Authorization Act, spearheaded by Senator Gillibrand and Marco Rubio, and then signed into law by President Biden, December 2022. This thing's a big deal. It signals a brand new level of openness from Congress, from the president to this topic. The provision states that any person with relevant UAP information can inform Congress without retaliation, regardless of any previous non-disclosure agreements. Big deal, signals that this topic is in a new sphere, and I think we'll get to this later on in the conversation, but probably had to be a big impetus for David Grusch feeling comfortable coming forward. But this is not a joke. If you're sitting there going, this idea is a joke, at the highest levels of government, it's not a joke. Sure, it could be a psyop, but it's not a clown show anymore.
Right. The Inspector General called Grusch's information urgent and credible. Those aren't words that they use, nonchalantly. Those are words that are taking this serious.
Before you keep going, were you surprised at this National Defense Authorization Act? Did it take you back, or were you expecting this sort of open discourse?
So the first one was FY22, and that sort of was when Congress had a shot across the bow, but it wasn't as strong. And so they gave DoD and the IC time to kind of digest how serious Congress was. And that's when they came back and whacked them with the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act provisions. Some of which you just read from, which are, yes, I encourage anyone who just wants to get like firsthand, gut feel for how serious this issue is just read the provisions that were passed by both houses of Congress on a bipartisan basis, signed into law. Just read the language that's in the law that is instructing. Most people don't read the language. Just read the language. It would be very surprising, I think, just how explicit the statutory languages. And it's long. It's like 30 pages of provisions. Reporting provisions, going back to January 1st, 1945, and doing a historical review of any U.S. government legacy UAP-related programs, including efforts to manipulate, deceive, or undermine public opinion on the subject. Literally, that's like, they hold that report by, I think, middle of next year.
Wait, is that an anecdote? When was Roswell again? 47?
Yeah.
47, 48, somewhere. Sorry. I was just curious what the timeline was. Yeah. Keep going.
So yeah, just read just read the language that's now the law of the land. That tells you just how serious this is. And that's the motivational structure behind all that's happened. The connection to Grusch, to kind of pull it full circle, was He came, and the dates I'm just doing from memory. He was assigned to the UAP task force in 2019, just before it became formally stood up in July 2020. But this was happening behind the scenes. It just didn't have a signed memo from the DepSec Def. But he was the National Defense. I think it was at that time he was the either the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, senior technical integration officer, and then shortly thereafter he moved to the National Reconnaissance Office. I may have that flipped, but he was in those two kind of very senior, very sort of important intelligence organs of the state. He was assigned to be a co-lead on the UAP task force, and the reason why he was assigned to that job is because in his position as the senior sort of technical integration officer, as a senior intelligence advisor to the director of the National Reconnaissance Office, his job was to put together the NRO's contributions to the presidential daily brief. The NRO manages what we call the National Overhead System. So all of our space satellites, the most classified stuff we got flying around up there, collects an enormous amount of intelligence. His job was to compile that intelligence on a daily basis for the director of NRO for compilation into the presidential's daily brief. And so, and also help put together the presidential daily brief, which is the most sensitive, most classified document in the U.S. government. Full stop.
So, I mean, just to translate, an extremely high-ranking, highly cleared intelligence officer, not just extremely high, right? We're not misreading that. I mean, at the highest levels of access.
Yes. So his rank was he was GS-15, which is the highest rank in the civilian service. Above that, you have to be a political, or it's the senior executive service. So he was he wasn't he was only he's 36 years old, so he's not an old gray beard, but he was GS-15 for a 36-year-old is he's very young to get that promotion to that level. But it's more a matter of his accesses. So according to the journalist Ross Coulthart, he had in the function that he was in, he had to have what are called tickets, right? So, and I had a number of these tickets. Is that you have top secret, special, sensitive compartmented information access granted via need to know to compartmented information, and there is a wide range of programs in the U.S. government that are protected under different sort of degrees of secrecy, right? They're all top secret, but there's a whole sort of universe of compartments. In the DoD, it's called Special Access Programs. In the intelligence community, it's called Compartmented Access Programs, SAPs and CAPs. And that is a whole infrastructure for how we protect very sensitive information. They have special control procedures, special access. You only get access to them via need to know. You are cleared as an individual to hold top secret information. You have to be read into a specific compartment of a SAP or a CAP. And so he was read into apparently over 2,000 SAPs, which is an insane number. That is insane. And so this explains why he was put into a role he was at the UAP task force, because the mandate from Congress to the task force, and that became ARROW, was you need to find out all the UAP related information inside the government to write this report to us. So you need to go and it is a massive sprawling bureaucracy, right? You need to find, so you're all right, if this stuff exists, it's got to be tucked away in some crazy SAPs. Who do we need to put on this team that has the clearances and has the accesses and now has the need to know to go out and interview people that might be involved in these things so we can meet our legislative mandate to Congress? So his job was to do that. And that's what he says he did, is that he spent about 2-3 years systematically going out and interviewing all of his colleagues and other people that he came into contact with throughout the government that told him what he reported to Ross Coulthart. So that is where we get to, which is he is reporting what he heard. So it's firsthand hearsay, right? So he's just relaying what these individuals came to him in the course of his official duties, interviewing them to collect information on these programs to meet congressional legislative intent, said, yes, I have been working on crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs of exotic technology that's not.
So this is where we meet the trees. We are.
Yes.
We're kind of traversing
yes.
right into the darkness at this point. And this is where, I mean, for anyone listening who hasn't been privy to this information yet, strap in, because this is just completely bonkers stuff that I just want to hear Matt's opinion on.
I mean, I watched it with my wife, and she knows my disposition. She knows I don't get raptured by, I mean, I'm not giving myself too much credit here, but I'm not the kind of guy you're going to hear on a street corner telling people there's aliens. We watched this together. I had to read the debrief article beforehand, and then we watched this, and we honestly, at one point, she had a glass of wine, I was one beer in, and we literally just were looking at each other, just like, what in the world? It's very hard, and actually the analyst on News Nation, I forget his name afterward, when Ross Coldhart was kind of unpacking this, I appreciated his demeanor. He was sitting there saying, this is just a lot to take in. Knowing who this guy is and what he is saying is something that my brain and my wife's brain weren't computing, and almost still haven't computed. Even in prepping for this talk, we're back into it, and I'm like, the shit he is divulging and suggesting from many different sources through extensive research and major high-level access is...
Well, the really crazy thing is that no matter how bonkers what he did talk about is, he inferred that there's a lot more to come. Like, there are more disclosures that are going to come, like, and it sounded almost imminent.
And he also named who else has this information. It's not as though this is, I mean, he can't share all this, and maybe you can get into more of these dynamics of intelligence, but it's not as though it's hidden and lost, and he says these individuals have the full extent of what I uncovered during my research, and he names those people. It's out there, and now Congress is once again doubling down that they're going to be looking into it. They're giving credence to who he is in this perspective. I guess the next step is maybe for you to explain what he's suggesting is reality.
Start9 operating system is a full-fledged, cutting-edge Linux operating system. Its functionality and adaptability make it an excellent choice for the users who value simplicity, efficiency, and privacy. Running a Bitcoin node? Start9 is your go-to solution. Setting up a node has never been so easy. With a Start9 server, backups are more than just an afterthought. At the push of a button, create encrypted backups, ensuring your data stays safe and sound out of the reach of big tech companies. Start9's commitment to security goes even further. StartOS is encrypted for all LAN communications. This ensures your passwords and assets are always protected. The StartOS marketplace of apps includes everything from Lightning to secure messaging apps to secure password management. If you care to be sovereign in the digital age, running a StartOS server is a must. And the best part? You can download and set up StartOS on any machine, or you can purchase a plug-and-play Start9 server directly from Start9. Choose Start9 for a secure, streamlined, and flexible computing experience. When Dan and I are at the firehouse and we have finally delivered the orange pill to a new plebe, we recommend Swan for their first Bitcoin purchase, always. Swan has the user interface absolutely nailed. We have seen people go from no-coiners to Bitcoiners in under a minute. It's just that easy. The problem with sending friends and family to other exchanges is exposing them to all kinds of BS. You will never see Swan encourage your friends or family to buy Dogecoin. Instead, Swan educates. Swan produces some of the best educational content in the space. That is a big freaking deal. The difference between somebody who buys on a whim and sells for a loss and those that hold for the long term is simply an education gap. We have been using Swan to dollar cost average into Bitcoin every single day since 2020. If you want a family member to turn into a Bitcoiner, there is no better place to go than Swan. For daily DCA, IRA, or education, Swan is the place to go. You can try Swan Premium on us for free. This includes exclusive Swan content, market insights, and other discounts. Click on our link in the show notes and use password BlueCollarBitcoin.
Yes. Yes. So he filed a whistleblower complaint in, I think, May or July, or May, June, or July of 2021. The Inspector General of the intelligence community took that complaint of that certain elements in the U.S. government were withholding illegally information on legacy UAP programs from the Congress. The Inspector General investigated that claim, and then in May, I believe it was May or April, reported it to the DNI and to Congress. This was of 2022. That they had deemed it urgent and credible, and that they referred. And so in the process of doing that investigation, they went out and investigated not only the individuals that Grusch says were the source of this information, and they went out and then investigated other individuals inside the intelligence community to corroborate the claims. That's the reporting, right? I don't know. This firsthand, but that's the reporting. The Inspector General, the intelligence community went and talked to the people that Grusch talked to and other individuals to substantiate at least some substance of these claims, and then said to those individuals and to Grusch, they notified the council of the legal counsel of the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence, SSCI, and HIPSI, the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence, which are insulated from the politicians to keep the investigation of a whistleblower and potential reprisal actions insulated from political interference, which is generally what's practiced. When you have a whistleblower report, you generally don't get the members of Congress involved in talking with the witnesses out of concern of political interference. So it's the council and the staff, professional staff, that have these accesses that that receive this information under sworn testimony. So he and other individuals were deposed, not only by the Inspector General, but by the Congressional Council of these two committees, and apparently they've given hours of testimony, hundreds of pages, and in that testimony are very specific things like these are the code word names of the programs that are being used to illegally cover these UAP activities that are not being reported to you. These are the contractors that are involved. This is the illegal violations of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, that are leading to the misdirection of taxpayer funds. These are like material misstatements made by like individuals involved in managing these programs, not reporting it per like legal requirements on special access programs. And this is where they're located. This is the facility where these crafts are being stored. Like literally, like the roadmap.
He literally names that he names like the location and facility where this shit's at.
Either he or other individuals that were referred to Congress have given apparently a roadmap to Congress. And so that is where it stands. It's all hearsay. It's like you have to go and knock on those doors and go show me this facility be whatever, right? And like open it up, right? Like this is, I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but like there's enough information apparently provided to Congress. The pickle they're in now is, okay, we've got this list of things and people and places. What do we do? Because Congress isn't, magical, right? Like they can't just like charter a Huey and go like airdrop over Lockheed Martin's desert facility and say, show me the bodies or whatever, right? Like they can't do that, right? So now they're just like, like what do we do with this? And I think they weren't prepared for this all happening as quickly as it's happened. They were aware of this testimony, but I think it had sort of surprised them how this story came out as quickly as it did. And I think they have a lot of time to prepare for like what the public response is. There's an article this morning just in Wired about, this guy went and got all the senators and congressmen on the record on response to the claims. And Senator Gillibrand basically said, I'm very concerned if there are rogue SAPs, special access programs, being used illegally. And I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to investigate this. And she's going to introduce, in the next National Defense Authorization Act, another set of legal provisions that specifically mandates, any congressional funds that are being used to support SAPs have to be reported. So there's this interplay between the whistleblower hints and leaks from the inside that turn into legislation that further try to like tighten the screws on what is, being alleged as like an illegal set of activities on these programs. David Grusch was the one, he was basically the first person to use this whistleblower provision that you just read from the December 22 National Defense Authorization Act, the sort of whistleblower protection, which said anyone that had been involved in legacy UAP programs that had signed non-disclosure agreements related to those programs was relieved of their obligations under those NDAs and could not be retaliated against if they came forward in the proper manner and disclosed those activities to ARROW and Congress. And there's some consternation that ARROW, the office inside the Pentagon that's now under the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, that was tasked by Congress to investigate this and was told basically to now report directly to the DepSecDef and the DNI that they're not taking this seriously. They're kind of stonewalling or stalling on investigating these claims. They may or not actually have the quote-unquote Title 50 intelligence authorities to do this systematic investigation that Grusch is sort of pointing in their direction. They may also not want to. And that's where we're in this sort of very tense, politically fraught moment where all these bureaucratic power centers are jockeying for position. And these are just so that's like the inside baseball. But the substance of his claims want to get into the meat of it, right?
Oh yeah, we do.
Are absolutely bonkers, right? Like we are
bonkers. Like we're not.
If we had to pick, if you had to pick, what is the most insane part of this? I don't want to go to that right off the bat, but there's so much of this that even any one individual piece of this would be crazy to hear. But he compiled what you could best be described as like an orgy of UFO information placed into a 1 hour segment, one after another, of all these disparate, different, crazy rabbit holes you could go down over the last 10 or 20 years, all just kind of compiled into one.
And although we don't have the stone cold evidence, and nor was that his point. His point is to direct Congress and those with the power to where to go find this evidence. The specificity of what he shares is what really got my attention. We're not talking about back to the Commander David Fravor, Ryan Graves encounters where it's very nebulous, unknown, impressive and freaky, but not just, hey, we saw this tic-tac thing on our radar and I saw it visually, but we have no clue what it is. He's getting into intact craft, bodies of extraterrestrial or non-human species, talking specifically about dates and times. Like Josh, you kicked it off he's talking about in 1933 under Mussolini, something crashed in Italy. Well, and the Vatican knew about it. He's giving validity to the Roswell and that was a complete cover up, totally misrepresented. He's saying something crashed there. I mean,
he's saying the Russians and the Chinese have also acquired some of these craft. I mean, I don't remember where I wrote these numbers down, but somebody was speculating between 12 and 15 of these craft are in possession in the U.S.
Yeah, it was one of the guys that came in and commented afterward was saying he knows 12. Sorry, who was that? I didn't.
It was he's a Substack kind of free speech journalist named Michael Sheldon, who apparently has been developing sources on the subject for a number of years. But
I think honestly, like if I was going to say what is the most obtuse claim out of all of this, is that he infers that there are more than one entity. He refers to non-human intelligences, like as if there are more than one we've had quote unquote contact with. That is probably, I mean, if it was just one, like that's hard to swallow. Multiples is even crazier. And then inferring that one of these multiple non-human intelligences is malicious or has been malicious, which is scary as hell.
Yeah. And to continue vomiting
all this information.
Well, I mean, Josh and I are just are processing this verbally and then handing it back to you. But other things I wrote down, they're interested in our nukes. So a lot of that stuff he corroborates.
That story's been in lore forever too.
Yeah.
That they deactivated nuclear weapons in Montana.
He talks about different isotopic ratios of elements. Like there's some stuff in this that really does line up with Lazar. And that's a question I have for you of like, I think last time you were here, you were saying you tend to think Lazar is a fabulist, but that element 115 stuff, he talks about totally unknown propulsion technologies. Lazar got into that whole gravity wave propulsion system, multiple crafts. I don't know. Console us. What stands out to you from what we just vomited in there or didn't?
Well, just on the Lazar point, if you recall, what I mentioned last time was that I believe Lazar is a fabulist, meaning he's lying, but that the substance of what he's talking about may be true. So that's what I was getting last time, which I think is still my position, given Grusch's claims. And so
Matt's like, dude, I don't want to bury myself by talking about this crazy stuff. Like giving these guys, like, I could see how this could get real sideways.
So this is where like. I get back to like principles of reasoning, trying to be rational, appraising evidence, no matter how crazy the claim. It's like, all right, get back to first principles. One of the difficulties with this whole subject is that it is very psychologically hard to be a Bayesian, right? Because there is sort of it's like a step function. It's like you're in a world where nothing in this entire regime has anything like an elevated credence. It is just the normal world. Humans are alone. Nothing weird is happening, right? Once you start updating from that claim to parts of claims that are in this other bucket of things, like crafts have been recovered, reverse engineering has occurred, right? Now, like psychologically, you think you're just tripping over a little bit into just saying, I'm just going a little bit far into the forest. I'm just saying that, yeah, David Fravor probably a reliable witness, and yeah, you get multiple sensors detecting these objects underwater in the atmosphere or in outer space.
That's
being detected with high resolution intelligence systems, characterizing their performance, with a level of resolution that is hard to explain, or indicating performance characteristics that are hard to explain, right? Just put it lightly. You can sort of rationally sort of put like, follow that path, right? And start to update credences on maybe there are some weird alien robots flying around, in our skies, and then you'd want to, accommodate yourself to that set of propositions. Now he's coming in and saying, not just that, but that actually they've crashed, and they have there's multiple morphologies, and that he even like hints at like agreements being made, right? Just like absolutely bonkers things, right? Which sounds bonkers from the perspective of nothing in that world is true. But like, if you're truly being a Bayesian, you're saying, all right, if I have updated my credences on there are
if any
real
one
objects,
of those things is true, yeah.
like if you ascribe a reasonably high credence to the proposition that non-human intelligence-based technical vehicles are in our physical presence, right? Then it's not like that much of a stretch to think we have physical possession of one of those objects. Like if they're real and they're here, it's like, all right, well, like you have to explain how we got a hold of them, why they would crash if they're so advanced, et cetera, et cetera. But like once you've adopted the position with a reasonable credence that they're real and they're here, us having possession of them isn't that crazy, right? Relative to that being your prior that you've updated on. And then once you've updated on that prior that we now have physical possession of these objects, you're like, well, these are objects that either have pilots or don't have pilots, right? That's it. There's only two possibilities, right? So then you have to ascribe a credence to the proposition either they're entirely robotic drones with no pilots or they have pilots. Put your credences across both those propositions. Prima facie, before I heard Grusch, I would say much more likely to be robots, much more likely to just be like alien drones if I ascribe a high credence to that original proposition. But now he's saying we've actually recovered, dead pilots. Okay.
Oh my God.
But now I have to just rebalance with respect to that part of the Bayesian tree. Now I have to say, all right, well, at least some of them, according to this guy, have pilots in them. Okay, interesting, right? But again, like this is where people, because they haven't followed that Bayesian trajectory, right? It's like when you put out the idea of bodies, it's like, that is insane. That is an absolutely absurd thing to state. But I don't know, maybe I'm just like inured to the insanity of the world because I've just seen lots of insane things over my life. And I'm just like, the world is absurd, the world is weird, the world doesn't necessarily conform to what you think it should be. It just is. And you have to like take it at face value and rationally appraise, circumstantial evidence with a reasonable background set of priors that you constantly reinvestigate over time, right? You don't never take anything as entirely for certain, right? Yeah, and so the point I really want to drill into, though, on this whole subject, which is, I think, gets lost a bit in like the drawing implications, right? It's like, okay, I'm not going to be able to want to convince anyone whether to believe Grusch or not. You can, everyone can make their own judgments. What I find more interesting to explore among lots of these questions is like, okay, taking it seriously and then examining different facets of what would be true in that world, right? And one facet that I think is underexplored is the reason to keep this a secret, right? Which I actually think,
I love that idea.
Like, why would you keep this a secret? And there's like the traditional government conspiracy. They don't want to let everyone know there's another top dog and undermine society and religion, whatever. There's another which is just they want to engineer the technology to get rich and create their own asymmetric advantages, yada yada. The other is it might be really dangerous, right? Like it just might be really, really bad to like let people figure out.
It could be part of an agreement.
Well,
or it could be. I mean, it could. And these. I mean, they're not. I mean, again, we're like, if we're talking about that analogy of the clearing, like we are way.
I just jumped ahead. I
we're
I got too deep. I want 100 meters in.
We're stipulating for the purposes of this analytical discussion. We're now paradropped into some part of the dark forest, and we're just like exploring the ideas here. But some of the things that have been said, not just from Grusch, but from the reporter that has talked to him and other sources, named Ross Coulthart. So some of this is anchoring on what Ross has said. So it's not like entirely just I'm just making it up. It's like, all right, now it's someone who's reporting information that, again, ascribe a credence to it as you evaluate it. But the substance of this claim is that these things, if you follow the story, were captured, were taken possession of. We're starting to figure this out, starting in the early 30s. What was humanity doing in the early 30s?
Working on nukes.
We were figuring out, fundamental physics. We're really figuring out what became the defining paradigm of modern physics in the 20s and 30s. We were figuring out quantum mechanics and general relativity. And in the course of doing those investigations in the 30s, Enrico Fermi, for example, is one individual who also was Italian at the time and was in Italy in the 30s, was the one who figured out nuclear physics. There are we know how the structure of the atom works, and we know, what if we actually took certain heavy elements and we smashed them into each other sufficiently high velocities that maybe if we get a critical mass density, you can create a runaway chain reaction that, using calculations from Einstein equals mc squared, right? The old traditional formula, that unlocks huge energy that we can convert potentially into power sources or weapons. And we did very quickly. Under the pressures and constraints of World War II, we turned what was basically entirely theoretical physics knowledge, 10 years, into world historical changing weapons and technology. I see that as a lesson that humanity has kind of forgotten, which is that new physics knowledge unlocks degrees of freedom that you can exploit with technology that can create a step function in what is available to you as a technological civilization, right? And we saw this with electromagnetism. We could just spin, magnets and coils and generate, power to light our cities. Industrial Revolution, burning chemicals to power steam engines. Then we had another step function with nuclear weapons, and unlocking quantum mechanics gave us integrated circuits. And now we have a modern technological civilization that is fundamentally downstream of physics, right? So I take seriously the UAP question not because of lots of other interesting things, but in particular, it's like a proof of concept that some other civilization figured out physics that we don't understand. And then they leverage that physics knowledge to create technology that gives them what appears to us like magical capabilities, right?
So I guess, just to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, what I was going to ask is, where I thought you were going for a second was, if we invented new physics that is not, the rest of the world is not apprised of, it's very possible that this could be something of origin from some deep state black project, potentially, which, along the Bayesian probability set, even now still seems like maybe the more reasonable way to approach this, possibly. Because the idea that some other alien civilization has invented this technology, has traveled probably thousands of light years, hundreds of light years, whatever it is, to get here. Assuming this technology is what they say, maybe that's not out of the realm of possibility. But it seems like the probability set is still probably on the side of, we've invented some technology that we're keeping secret. What are your thoughts on that?
They're not mutually exclusive, I would say, right? So there's like 4 possible explanations that exhaust the space of explanations for UAPs. Like, one, we're victims of systematic error or, just mistaken, right? Like, all of our sensors, all of our reports, all these individuals, they're just confused. They're mistaken. Right. The second is systematic deception or manipulation. That some group, for whatever reason, is investing lots of amounts of resources in making us believe that these things are real, and for whatever purposes. But there's some group that has the intent and capability to systematically deceive us as a mass public to believing something like this is happening. The third is that it's real technology, but that it's a secret human technology, right? To your point, that we figured out some aspect of physics and we really wanted to keep it super secret. So we built these crazy devices. We only kept them in the bunker for, a crazy, strategic event. Like, we're going to go to war with China. We need to bring this thing out of the box. So we need to give China a hint that maybe we have this, ace in the hole.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you. Like, what would be the reason for it if 3 was the case? Like, why would we want? It seemed like what they were doing up until this point was going well. Like, just allow the crazy UFO people to be the crazy UFO people. Let them, do their own thing. Why bring this out into the open in this manner?
Yeah. So if you're trying to construct a prior for scenario 3, you have to motivate it with the most plausible story. The most plausible story would be, we figured out some aspect of physics in the post World War II era that give us a clue into something like what could be the next nuke. And we learned the lesson of the 30s and 40s, which is that whoever figures out the next physics is going to have a strategic military advantage. And you pour lots of money in super secret projects to figure out how to exploit that known physics. You then manipulate most of public physics away from that trajectory. Eric, this is sort of Eric Weinstein's thesis, is that we figured out something to do with general relativity and gravity in the 50s, and then it just sort of it disappeared. And then in the 70s, we sort of got distracted with string theory and physics. Theoretical physics has basically been stalled for 50 years. On the scenario 3 explanation, there's no non-human intelligence in that just narrow view of scenario 3, it is all secret government projects leveraging breakthrough physics to create an asymmetric military capability that they kept in the dark for decades, only to bring out in a geopolitical environment where their hegemonic power is challenged, in which case you see China rising in power. They might have a conventional overmatch in the South China Sea. So we're going to slowly start to leak the fact that actually we have other capabilities that China didn't
Interesting.
their war plan, and we're going to correlate that disclosure timeline with the timeline associated with China's ambitions in Taiwan, which all conveniently center around 2027, et cetera. That's how I would construct a story to explain. It doesn't explain the fact that people were seeing these reports in the 30s, and the 40s, and the 50s, that like you have now fully functioning craft that are doing these crazy things very soon after supposedly, like you're imagining quite a quick jump from you know what are pretty primitive planes in World War II to like Tic Tacs. Like that's a bit of a leap, right? Which makes you think, okay, scenario 3 and scenario 4 aren't entirely exclusive, right? In fact, you could construct a hypothesis that if scenario 4 is true, non-human technology, UAPs represent non-human technology, that, well, governments of the world would really want to figure out how that works and would want to try to emulate it in secret programs. I mean, that's what I would do. And you would treat those things as like, at least at the level as how you currently treat like nuclear secrets. So we have an entire separate classification regime for nuclear secrets that's run by the Department of Energy. You have to get a whole separate clearance for nuclear secrets. And they have, things like restricted data for nuclear weapons design, the function and design and purpose of a nuclear weapons. That's all separately compartmented, separately controlled from intelligence sources and methods, information, top secret. Yeah. You would put like anything to do with like figuring out the physics behind these objects. You would put that under probably a classification regime much closer to how you protect nuclear physics, because the dashed line between nuclear physics and nuclear weapons, you would assume is a similar dashed line between whatever the physics of these objects is and whatever weapons could be engineered as a result. And if you don't fully understand like the physics, you don't fully understand like if it could be used to power a ship, can it be used to create a weapon? You don't know that. So your presumption as an intelligence military service would be this is as a strategic secret as exists, and we will do whatever is necessary to protect this secret. It is the most important thing to protect, not just for U.S. national security, but for potentially humanity's security, right? Like you let that genie out of the box, like we're worried about that with AI right now, and it's apparently a topic of safe discourse to worry about runaway artificial superintelligence that some scientists are going to engineer some technology in a box, and that technology is going to escape the box and turn us all into paper clips, right? That's like a serious like belief system that's motivating a whole bunch of anxiety among techno elites and politicians to regulate AI. That's considered like a socially acceptable topic of analysis and policy to discourse. The idea that we might have figured out or might have encountered might be dealing with some advanced technology that indicates advanced physics that could be a similar existential risk to humanity, we can't talk about that. That's taboo. That's fringe. And I'm just like, I don't know. Like, there seems to be as much circumstantial evidence now, especially post-Grusch, that we can empirically investigate. It's like we can get to the bottom of these claims. We can go to those locations. We can pressure Congress to go run this down.
Where are you landing on this distribution as far as after post-Grusch? You laid out those 4 possibilities for this. Where are you putting your most of your credence on these 4 points?
I'm probably 90% on number 4.
Wow,
that's a statement right there.
I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, so like.
But you could also posit that number 4 is correct. We have been backwards engineering these things, and now we're trying. I mean, the reasoning for coming out like this at this point, you could draw all kinds of different conclusions to, but it could also be it could be related to China and their rise as well. Like we're trying to say, hey, look, we have backward engineered this stuff. We do have the ability to use it at some level. And I mean, that could also be playing into this geopolitically.
Yes. And that's actually where I find it interesting, not just from like an intellectual, but from a geopolitical perspective, because if you grant all this is true, it doesn't stay in the box, right? It's just like, oh, it's a nice and cool, the aliens are a real thing. It's like, now I have to factor this into lots of other sort of analytical questions that I need to professionally evaluate, right? Which
yeah,
is like,
that was going to be one of my questions, was whether this is a legit risk scenario you've brought into your consulting practice. And it sounds like, even though it's
I'm not talking to, the clients, again, the clients have very classical problems, right? Their job is to figure out their network architecture.
This is number one when you consult. Like, all right, have you thought about aliens yet? Hey, Bud Light, have you guys thought through Mulaney and then gotten to aliens to make sure Bud Light survives the next 10 years?
I mean, it's interesting. I chatted with Pete Hendry last week, right? On his podcast, and we went through this question, and it was like a serious like financial question. It's like, how would you price that in the markets, right? Like, how would you price this? Like, what economic decisions get affected by this? And it's hard to think through, right? Like, and it depends. I guess this is a whole separate conversation. Like, if you were trying to like bet on this, right? Like, make a wager. And I thought about this. Like, if I had reasonably high credence that something like this is true, and that, importantly, I can believe that it's true, but it's irrelevant, right? It's a matter of what the market believes is true, right? So you're really making a statement about what do you think the median credence level is, and what do you think that's going to change over what period of time, and then what financial assets would likely change in value as a result of that change in beliefs over that particular proposition. Like, that's an interesting question to analyze.
I think this is an important question just to parlay into. You said 90% number 4, but that doesn't really include this probability set at all, whereas this is true or not true. So I don't want people to say, oh, Matt says this is 90% true. I think you were just choosing number 4 as out of those 4 options. Do you think this is generally true overall, or is this just a smokescreen?
Well, if those are only 4 possible options, and I'm putting like the mass of my credences as like a lump, I'm putting 90% of that lump on number 4, right? Okay. As a proposition that UAPs represent non-human technology that's physically in our presence, right? That's like the proposition. 90%. That I wouldn't say on 90% on all of Grusch's claims, right? Which are further down the Bayesian tree, right? Like this is like the root claim that UAPs are non-human technology and they're real and they're physically, in our presence. Like, that's like the root claim of 90%. Then I have like a decay that goes pretty far, I'd say, down below 50% on these claims like bodies are real and we've successfully, reverse engineered these things. I have very, very low credence that we've successfully reverse engineered these things.
So one question on this topic, because for blokes like us, the Lazar story is fascinating, and we didn't get into it a ton the last time you were on here. But in terms of, Lazar's claims of being in Area S4 near Area 51, reverse engineering propulsion technology, to the physics stuff he talked about, he was a physicist, or so he claims, working on gravity wave propulsion, effectively claiming that you can bend space-time, or that these non-human technologies can bend space-time and effectively move the craft great distances instantaneously. He talked about potentially being aware of beings. I think he called them grays, seeing, I think he said 9 craft. How does that line up with the Grusch story? Have you changed your mind at all on Lazar? And if you are suggesting that Lazar's himself kind of full of shit, is the notion there that he just got access to some program or some information and sort of made up a story that lines up with intelligence that he got somewhere else? Just give us a brief Lazar take right now on your end.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, it's like, we have Grusch now. I don't know why you need Lazar. Like Grusch is infinitely more credible and much more willing to dedicate, energy to than Lazar. But if you want to play like a historical game of like, do we need to vindicate Lazar from all of the shit he got? I don't think so. I think he's fundamentally a liar. I think he's making stuff up. But if you're trying to explain how he got to the claims he made, like, he was in the place where he was. He probably was a recipient of second and third hand rumors in that area. So like, if you assume the Grusch's claims are true, maybe there was some stuff happening out, in Groom Lake, right?
Yeah.
Like, maybe that underlying story was true. Maybe like rumor mill got out there, and he's a guy who's like, I can turn this into a personal thing, and then he spins a tale that has elements of truth that he's heard through, the bar conversations and in that location, and then he sort of spins a tale.
I'm just curious, what is it about Lazar that makes you think that this is a tall tale?
His education records, he's like a pimp. I don't know, like, again, like,
they were just trying to muddy the waters.
Hey, let's not be so harsh on pimps here, dude.
Respect. It strikes me that, like, yeah, people anchor so much on Lazar personally, and they think that like so much stands or falls with his personal credibility. I think he's irrelevant to the
Yeah.
conversation.
I think people, especially that have heard the Lazar story, now hear this, and there's so many parallels that they're like, oh shit, maybe Lazar was legit after all.
But I think there's also many, many other cases of people that, have come forward with claims in keeping with Grusch's claims, but they were not bombastic about it. They just sort of, either on their just whispered to somebody or, whatever, have just said, yeah, well, I did this weird thing. I was on this program, and then it dies, right? But Lazar, because he created a whole, mythology around himself, and he did all these interviews, right? Like he's the one that's like the canonical reference point for comparing Grusch's like claims. And I think that's unfair to Grusch, right? To put Lazar up against him is like, all right, well, how do these two like? It's just I would like throw him off the screen and be like, you now have someone with much more professional bona fides coming forward, being vouched for by people inside the government that said he is who he says he is, he had the accesses that he says he had, and he's coming forward through the legitimate whistleblower process to go through Congress and the ICIG. Like, is an entirely different universe of like credibility and seriousness that Grusch's claims warrant attention to than Lazar's. And so it's like, you're just mixing oil and water by putting those two together.
And I think it's also worth saying we have to factor in potentially wayward, narcissistic incentives. You come out with claims like this. Let's take Lazar, and let's also, I know Grusch has a totally different pedigree, but let's throw him in here too. You come out with claims like this, you're going to be a hero to this fanboy manic UFO community. You're probably going on Joe Rogan. You're going to be in some sense a fringe spotlight kind of for the rest of your life within a certain community. So there would be incentives and reasons for, say, narcissistic fabulists to make some crazy shit up and send their life on a totally different trajectory.
Yeah, but in Grusch's case, he's testified to Congress under oath. So, I mean, he has put himself in a position where he could get in some deep shit.
He can maybe mislead some prison inmates if he's full of shit. Yeah.
I mean, I've known people in the intelligence career, like to be GS-15, 36 years old, the positions he was in, he was a superstar, right? Like I mean, I'm 36, right? Like, and if I was doing the government track, I would be very happy. I'd be like, man, I really crushed it if I got to be GS-15 at my age and the positions of access and responsibility that he was in. So he was poised for a really exceptional career inside the government. He could have just kept his mouth shut and probably gotten a really plum job as a defense contractor, gotten a senior government position down the line. He was like really crushing it in his professional career. And he decided, I'm just going to burn all that. I'm going to burn all that to the ground because he's done. He's done inside the government.
Yeah.
He has to like try to become a real estate agent. And I guarantee you, like, the UFO circuit is not going to be as like professionally and financially rewarding as like where he was already on the trajectory.
Don't worry, we'll have him on BCB for sure.
The UFO circuit.
He's made a credible signal. He's done the proof of work, right? He's made a credible signal. He's incurred a very significant personal cost, right, to come up with this information, and so you have to factor that into how you evaluate, his credibility. But I think it's fair read that he gave up a lot to do what he's doing now. And I think what's very interesting, right, to like pivot, okay, well, what's next, right? All we have, circumstantial evidence, hearsay, no firsthand evidence, no firsthand accounts. So that's where we are, right? And I think we're in a very interesting moment because now things are kind of in limbo, right? You're like, okay, I had to revise my priors upwards, but am I all the way there? Probably not, right? And like I've looked at this and I have some other information that makes maybe my personal credence is higher than others, but I would expect others not to have credences as high as me. But then I'm looking for, okay, what other events would, raise the median credence level, right? And I think there are things that are going to come that will do that.
That was my next question for you. I wanted some wild speculation because Ross Coldhart inferred, I mean, he said this on his podcast, the most recent episode, that he has a lot more information that he's heard from other, participants that haven't come forward yet. If you had to make a guess, and it sounds like maybe you do have some other information that you don't want to share, but what do you think would potentially be the next thing to drop?
Well, I mean, we know Grusch has said he talked with many other people inside these programs that all gave testimony to the Inspector General and that have given testimony to Congress, that have gone through a similar deposition, oath-taking, and disclosure in a closed setting. The question is, do they feel like they have the personal protections to do what Grusch just did, which is
not get Epsteined?
Well, the interesting thing is Grusch was able to come out and say things that were told to him that the DOPSA, the Defense Oversight Pre-Publication Review Board, said were not classified because he was not read into those programs. He never signed those NDAs, right? And it's his hearsay claim. It's not government saying this is true. It's just saying he's saying these things. We're not saying it's true.
Right.
Yeah.
We're just giving him permission to speak about things that are not, explicitly classified as far as DOPSA is aware of, right? But if there's illegal activities taking place, so this is kind of the nuance, right? Like you might have multiple special access programs dedicated to foreign technology recovery, reverse engineering, right? Russian space hypersonic missile satellites. We have special teams go out there, take it, reverse engineer it, right? Everyone kind of expects something like that is taking place. Those would be special activity programs, right? How you do that, where they go, how those programs are organized, what they're focused on, all that would be very classified. Legally classified, and SAPs that would be funded and reported to Congress through the appropriate mechanisms. There's a Special Access Program Coordinating Office, SAPCO, that Christopher Mellon and Lou Elizondo were actually a part of. Lou Elizondo was actually the executive secretary for it. Very highly cleared person. And those programs get briefed up to at least the Gang of Eight. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the SAP, it gets briefed to the other parts of the members of the HIPSI and SSCI. His allegation to the ICIG that was deemed urgent and credible is that there were UAP-related activities being conducted under legal SAPs, but that were themselves illegal, meaning not authorized by charter, and represented misappropriation of funds for that legal SAP. He also alleges that there are separate programs that are not covered by a legal SAP, that are not being officially disclosed to through even unacknowledged waived special access programs where they're verbally briefed to the Gang of Eight, maybe even the Gang of Four. He's saying that hasn't happened. And so those things are not legally valid classified information. To reveal them isn't violating a non-disclosure agreement, not violating the oath to protect classified information. Because the information is about a program that isn't legal. It's not a real SAP. It's not a SAP that's legally authorized. It's not a SAP that anyone has, and in particular, the non-disclosure agreements that were covered by that whistleblower protection, which is why it's so strategically critical, specifically released any individual who had signed an NDA relating to UAP-related programs that were not properly disclosed to Congress. You see why this is that language.
Yes.
That language was put in there for a reason, because of these individuals.
And you can also start to understand why, when he's being interviewed, he's tiptoeing around different things. You're like, wait, why is he sharing so much about this and then nothing about this? And is that some of that makes sense, that he's tiptoeing between what are legit SAPs and aren't, and just kind of navigating this whole web of what he can and can't share to remain partially above water as a whistleblower?
That's my read, is that
Wow.
the things he's saying are reports of activities that were being conducted illicitly, not under the proper remit of an authorized, legally reported SAP charter. And so therefore, he's not violating any oaths to protect classified information by revealing those pieces of information. This is also why, like Senator Gillibrand, her statements are very interesting, which she says, if there have been rogue SAPs, I need to get to the bottom of it. If there's there's like the alien story, but there's also just like the bureaucratic, good government thing, which is like, okay, we have a system of government that authorizes certain activities. There's certain regimes of disclosure, accountability, and transparency. We protect sources and methods. We protect secret programs that are, valid uses of that money, and those legal authorities granted to the government, the executive branch, military and intelligence services by Congress. But there's a condition. You have to report those activities and account for the money to Congress. This is how you have checks and balances in a democratic system. Fundamentally, his allegation at the root of it isn't like this whole alien thing. People get, that's like the sexy thing. It's that people broke the law. People stole money, basically. People didn't follow the proper legal oversight regimes that we have to make sure. We saw this in the 60s and 70s when, aspects of the government go out of their remit, right? That get out ahead of government accountability. And we had church committee hearings, and there was a lot of crazy shit that we found out that the government was doing. We found about things like MK Ultra. We found about things like LSD experiments on American citizens.
Yeah, that's an that's a whole rabbit hole I've been down, and that is
I mean, but
nuts.
like that's the lesson of history. Like everyone gets caught up in the conspiracies around all that stuff. But like for me, it's a historical fact, and it's a matter of just like political economy that when you put a lot of money and a lot of power in a certain institution, and you don't like check it, you don't force it to account to a third party, it can go off the rails. It just like that's what humans do, right? And I think this is just like, okay, this happened to be on this topic of some crazy bonkers subject,
Right.
but it's like it's a typical human story of institutions basically insulating themselves, protecting their own interests, subverting oversight and accountability on their activities, and the job of a democratic society is to like come in there and be like, no, like it's my money, I don't want you to like siphon it off and not tell my representatives what you're doing with it. Like that's a basic story.
And maybe it takes something with this big of implications and that's this fascinating and scary, or however you put it, to take down some red tape, to shed some light on some black programs. And it sounds like that's what some of these senators are up to. They're like, let's rip some of this tape down, let's get the spotlights out, and if we learn about some fucking aliens in the process, we're in for it. I'm strapped in.
That's the funniest part of this whole thing, is that if this is where it's going to happen on probably the most important issue that's ever crossed the line of humanity, like that there are other entities out there that are intelligent and they're here visiting us, that's it's pretty wild. This whole story is so off the wall. It's crazy.
I know we might, I mean, I got a little bit more time, but like one of the last, I think people, so like tactical next steps, I think there might be some hearings. There's already talk about that. I think the House, I'm not as happy with the House. Like the House is full of people that I think are really, jazzed about this topic, but are not necessarily the most credible vehicles for this information. Like they have a lot of other political baggage, and I also worry about the tendency of our political system to take something like this and like warp it, just like we saw Bitcoin potentially get warped in the political culture wars. That you can easily imagine people that are naturally disposed to distrust government, to think it's all a deep state conspiracy, to try to seize on this issue as a cudgel to whack the government and to sort of fuel the wider swath of conspiracy thinking that prevails in our society. And I really want to resist that. Like I'm not it's like this is something that needs to be examined seriously and like have like oversight from like lawfully mandated investigative bodies. But I do not want this to become like this fuel about undermining further trust in our democratic institutions. Like I'm really scared that like if we come out and people just be like, all right, yeah, see, like we told you, like the deep state is doing all this stuff and we need to like take them all down, and that becomes fuel for much more radical like political activities that I would not be in favor of.
It's hard. I mean, this is such a crazy. It's just such a crazy idea that it's hard for me to believe that anybody would take away from this. Like the wonder of what is out there at this point that you are getting revealed to you. I mean, whatever's going on in government is such a secondhand backstory to that in my mind that it's hard to believe that people would even really care about that.
Dude, the thing is though, a lot of people just don't care. Like it's almost like people have been completely desensitized to proper research, information gathering, and rationality. And I get it to a certain extent. Like in a lot of ways, I feel small, I feel helpless, I feel ill-equipped to really research this stuff and make good judgments. And I think good information has been washed down to such an extent, and things have gotten so crazy in the, say, political sphere and main news outlet sphere and whatever else you want to lump in there, that a lot of people just have their brain completely turned off to what maybe 50 years ago would have been mind-blowing information. I mean, even sharing this at the firehouse, trying to give Spark Notes, a couple people are interested and other people are like, okay, whatever, I don't give a shit. I'm like, you don't give a shit about like what the fuck do you give a shit about then?
I was talking to some people and they were just like, okay, if this comes, like, what do you expect? I'm like, I expect a wow shrug. I expect a wow. I've got to go drop my kids off at school tomorrow, right? Until it changes their daily life. Like, what do you like? People are gonna be like, yeah, it's weird, right?
It's like people just lack imagination at all. Like they're just gonna stare at Instagram and flip through the next. All right, what's next?
And this is why I do have some sympathy for those in the government that might want to slow this down, right? Like, I don't think I don't think if you ask the folks in the Gang of Eight, if you ask Jill LeBrand or Rubio, who I think are the folks most plugged into some of the stuff, Mark Warner, they would want this to like all come tumbling out like we saw in the last week with Grusch making these wild claims. Like that's our political system. Like in general, like we accommodate slow change, right? And I think if you're saying you're putting them in a very difficult position of like wanting to drive transparency on this issue in a serious, deliberative manner, but if you force them to like reckon with these very, like bombastic claims, it's their natural impulse is going to be to like distance and deny because they're just not ready. Like the political system isn't ready to like accommodate that, right? And so I get that. Like, and I think there's a lot of impatience there's a whole subculture, just like how UFO, like there's an anthropological similarity, sociological similarity between Bitcoin communities and the UAP communities. Like they all have this like somewhat in-group jargon and lore and history and sort of influencers and podcasts, and they also have like a vision for the evolution of the world that aligns to their political kind of eschatology that hyper-Bitcoinization or disclosure is coming. And it's ironic that like Gillibrand is like both like co-sponsor legislation with Lummis on the crypto stuff as well as leading the charge on the UAP stuff. I don't think it's much of a that's just a coincidence. But yeah, like this is the sense of in these communities are somewhat insular. They have constructed a mythology. They've constructed a sort of grand set of expectations that, is always impatient for the next big thing of news, the big whistleblower, blah, blah. And I think it's like now that this is sort of happening, they're all like, freaking out. But I'm like, I step back and I'm looking, what's good for society at large? Like, what can our political system take? What is the Joe Bob in the street who's got to like pay their taxes and buy into civic society, right? You don't want to just like destabilize these things. Like it's like that's just you're just burning the house down, right? Like I don't know, I'm fundamentally more like, all right, how do we like we need to reckon with this if this is true, and we need to like do this in a deliberative manner. But I don't want to be reckless about it, and I'm not like cheerleading like just because it's this crazy interesting thing. It's like if I'm taking it seriously, there's financial implications, social implications, geopolitical implications. And you don't just like flip the table over and be like,
"Yep,
deal with it." Right?
Totally agree.
And to wrap some of this episode full circle, because we started off injecting a dose of skepticism towards Bitcoin, which is what this podcast is all about. And I do encourage the listener to blunt my arrows I threw a little bit ago. Be skeptical about this. Look at it with neutrality, but you should start assessing the evidence. Bold claims do need backup, as I said earlier, and there's a lot of utterly fantastical stuff that's been said by this guy and other people. It violates everything I and most people have ever known and ever experienced firsthand, and we haven't seen all the evidence. We've heard claims of the evidence. So I'm still waiting. I'm waiting to see stuff, but I am investigating and looking into it, and I think that's the proper demeanor. I think to completely ignore this right now, if you're a curious human being, is a mistake.
Yeah, I'd say like just knowing what the uncontested facts of the situation are, you either have senior intelligence military officials that are delusional, that have been in the grip of some crazy conspiracy that is utterly detached from reality, and that needs to be investigated because why are these people in positions of responsibility?
Right.
Why are they handling some of the most sensitive information? There's a significant disinformation program being run by people who are trying to make us think this. Well, that needs to be investigated. Why are they manipulating public opinion in this manner, possibly illegally? Or it's true. And it's like either scenario.
None of those scenarios are great.
And they all need to be investigated.
So it's like I don't see how anyone can hold a position that there's nothing to see here. There's nothing that warrants serious investigation. I think the uncontested facts warrant, no matter what your underlying beliefs of the true reality behind like what we're observing in these public statements and these reports, needs to be investigated by institutions that have some shred of accountability and legitimacy. And at this point, there's not too many of those. It's the mainstream media. It is Congress. It is lawful investigative bodies like the Inspector Generals. It's like we don't have many like somewhat neutral third-party groups who can like take these fantastical claims and run them to ground and try to adjudicate what is I think a very important issue. So like that's my position is like you should be in favor of serious investigations that are politically neutral, that are rigorous, that are done in public, and get to the bottom of it. Because I think we're in a very unhealthy position right now where it's like you're in like this limbo land, and everyone can kind of read in the Rorschach test of whatever conspiracy. It's all a psyop. It's all a distraction. The government is trying to, come up with the aliens because they expect, big financial crisis. Like everyone sees this event, sees this reporting, and then layers it into their existing ideological
their own lens.
And I just think, you need something a little bit more and that's fueled by being in this very awkward limbo land. You need to resolve it, and I think that's the only path forward.
Just when we thought things couldn't get any stranger, aliens show up. Matt, really appreciate it, man. That was a hell of an episode. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Anything you want to say here as we part? Hand people off to any of your work?
Well, so I find this topic interesting. But, I wouldn't get, sometimes folks get too worked up over, get emotionally invested in lots of things. I'm just I'm detached from a lot of these things. So just pay attention, treat everything lightly. Don't freak out, right? Just don't let the feed overwhelm you. And I have a day job and I focus a lot on solving tactical problems. And I think these are very interesting issues. Cybersecurity, geopolitics, emerging technology that, keep me up at night. And the UAP thing, if it comes in from the left side of the house and starts coming into the center of the discourse, I don't know. I just feel like I need to be prepared for lots of left tail events. Hit me up at Matthew_Pines, that's where I sort of riff on these sorts of topics. So thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, man. Josh, I hope this isn't our last time with Matt, but we'll give Chris a break here for a few months at the very least. And
at least this is the last time we speak to Chris prior to the alien disclosure, right?
Chris is if you want to separate your job and consulting from this, Chris is the UAP version. And Matt's the consultant version.
I'll go anon.
Yeah. Appreciate you.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.